There is a very specific moment in the collapse of any sports institution where the lies become too expensive to maintain, where the spin doctors run out of angles, where the carefully constructed wall of official statements, curated press conference answers, and strategic media blackouts finally buckles under the weight of what every single person watching already knows to be true. We have arrived at that moment, right now, today. And the people responsible for building that wall are standing in the rubble, microphone in hand, still trying to convince you that the demolition was part of the plan. For weeks, for months, the basketball establishment has been running one of the most coordinated, most condescending, most deeply insulting campaigns of institutional gaslighting that the sport has ever witnessed. They stood in front of cameras, they stood in front of packed press rooms, they looked analysts dead in the eye, they looked fans dead in the eye, and they delivered their talking points with the confidence of people who genuinely believed the rest of the world was too distracted, too uninformed, or too deferential to push back. They told you the decisions being made were tactical masterstrokes. They told you patience was required. They told you the process had a logic to it that mere fans and so-called analysts simply couldn't appreciate. They wrapped their choices in the language of veteran leadership, of institutional respect, of unwritten codes that govern how a national team operates, as though those unwritten codes were handed down from a mountain and not invented by the very people benefiting from them. And the entire time, anyone with functioning eyes and a basic command of modern basketball could see exactly what was happening. Not a masterclass in roster management, not a sophisticated long-term strategy, a staggering, ego-driven, politically motivated miscalculation, one that was actively making the best team in the world worse than it needed to be, every single night, in ways that the stat sheet was politely screaming about if anyone bothered to look. But something shifted after the New Zealand game. Something cracked. And it didn't crack because of fan pressure or social media outrage or the avalanche of analytical content pointing out the obvious. It cracked because the interim head coach himself walked up to a microphone, opened his mouth, and accidentally handed the entire basketball world the confession they had been waiting for. He didn't mean to do it. He was probably trying to do the opposite. But when you are managing a contradiction this large, when you are trying to simultaneously defend decisions that cannot be defended while standing in front of people paid to ask hard questions, eventually the truth leaks through the seams. And when it does, it doesn't trickle, it floods. What we are about to do is not a rant. It is not a reaction video. It is not an emotional hot take driven by fandom. What we are about to do is conduct the kind of cold, methodical, evidence-based forensic breakdown that the mainstream basketball media has been either too cowardly or too politically compromised to attempt. We are going to go line by line through the press conference. We are going to pull up the box score. We are going to examine the tactical tape. And by the time we are done, there will not be a single person watching this who can look at the coaching staff's decisions and call them anything other than what they are. A series of compounding, self-inflicted mistakes driven not by basketball logic, but by institutional politics and the desperate need to protect a hierarchy that the game itself is already rendering obsolete. Buckle in. This is going to be thorough. Let's establish exactly what happened and exactly why it matters, because the mainstream coverage of this press conference was so spectacularly lazy and so transparently agenda-driven that most people who watched the clips probably walked away with the exact wrong takeaway. Caitlin Clark gets the starting nod against New Zealand. The basketball world, or at least the part of it that has been paying attention, exhales. Finally! The decision that should have been made weeks ago, the decision that data and common sense and every relevant performance metric had been loudly demanding, is made. Clark is in the starting five. And the opening minutes of the game against New Zealand are not, to put it charitably, a seamless symphony of offensive basketball. The unit looks hesitant, spacing is off, the flow of the offense doesn't click into gear the way it should for a group of players at this level. And when Nate Tibbetts steps to the podium after the game, he addresses this directly. He says, and this is almost verbatim, that they weren't great in the first quarter.
He says the second group came in and really set the tone. He talks about wanting consistency from group to group. The phrasing is measured, careful, wrapped in the diplomatic cotton wool that coaches deploy when they want to communicate something without being directly quoted saying it. But the message is clear enough that the clickbait industrial complex immediately pounced. The hot take merchants, the agenda-driven analysts who had been arguing against Clark's inclusion from the beginning. They screamed from every platform they had access to that the coach was confirming their narrative, that Caitlin Clark had failed in her first start, that the sluggish first quarter proved she wasn't ready, that the veterans who had been quietly, passive-aggressively undermining her case for months were right all along. Except that is not what Tibbetts said, and more importantly, that is not what the basketball tells us when you actually watch it.
Tibbetts was not throwing Caitlin Clark under the bus. He was, whether he intended to or not, throwing his own lineup construction directly under a fleet of buses moving at top speed. Because the question that nobody in that press room thought to ask, the question that cuts through all the diplomatic packaging and gets to the actual root of the problem, is devastatingly simple. If you were going to finally start the most dynamic, most pace-dependent, most transition-oriented point guard in the history of the modern women's game, why in the world would you pair her with a player who operates at a fundamentally incompatible offensive frequency? Why would you do that and then stand at a microphone acting surprised when the chemistry is clunky? The first quarter struggles were not evidence that Clark wasn't ready to start. They were evidence that the coaching staff doesn't fully understand or is unwilling to fully commit to what starting Caitlin Clark actually requires. And that distinction is not a minor technical footnote, it is the entire story. But to really understand why the lineup construction was such a catastrophic error, you have to go deeper into the basketball. You have to understand what you're actually working with when you put Caitlin Clark on the floor and what it means to actively waste that by surrounding her with the wrong personnel. Which brings us to what might be the best and most damning metaphor for what this coaching staff has been doing. Picture the fastest production car ever built. 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds, a top speed that makes highway driving feel like a parking lot. An engine tuned to operate at a level of performance so extreme that it requires a specific grade of fuel, a specific type of road surface, and a specific set of conditions to perform at what it was designed to do. Now put it in a single-lane construction zone. Put a tractor in front of it and tell it to follow the tractor's pace, defer to the tractor's navigation choices, and not honk. That is Caitlin Clark alongside Chelsea Gray in a starting backcourt, and the fact that anyone in a national team coaching capacity thought that pairing made tactical sense is one of the most revealing windows into the decision-making culture of this entire organization. Chelsea Gray is, without any qualification or caveat, an elite basketball player. She is a legend. She is a player who has earned every ounce of respect and every accolade she has accumulated over a long and distinguished career. None of what follows is a criticism of Chelsea Gray, the basketball player. It is a critique of the coaching staff's failure to understand that having two elite players does not automatically mean those elite players complement each other or should share the same starting backcourt. Gray is a half-court operator. She is methodical, precise, brilliant at reading defenses in their set formations, extraordinary at controlling tempo in the kind of slow, grinding, possession-by-possession basketball that grinds opponents down over the course of 4 quarters. Her value is maximized when the game slows down, when there is time to probe, to reset, to find the right angle on the right possession with the patience of someone who has been doing this at the highest level for a decade. She is, in the most complimentary possible reading of the phrase, a tractor driver. She is built for endurance, for efficiency, for the long haul. Caitlin Clark is the exact opposite in almost every relevant dimension. Clark's greatest offensive weapon, the thing that makes her categorically, historically different from every guard who has come before her in this sport, is her ability to operate in transition, to push tempo before defenses have time to organize, to get to her spots at a pace that makes conventional defensive schemes structurally obsolete before they even have a chance to engage.
Her logo-range shooting forces defenders to respect her from distances that are simply not on the defensive playbook for most teams, which creates driving lanes, which creates kick-out opportunities, which creates the kind of cascading offensive chaos that makes a team with her on the floor nearly impossible to game plan against, but only if you actually let her run at the pace she was built for. When Clark gets a defensive rebound or when her team secures possession in transition, the natural and instinctive thing for her to do is push immediately, before the defense can sprint back and organize, before the opponent can get into their defensive assignments. The whole point of having a guard who can shoot from 30 feet is that you can operate at a pace where conventional defensive organization cannot keep up. Every fraction of a second that Clark uses to push the pace is a fraction of a second in which the defense is more disorganized, more vulnerable, more likely to give up the kind of high percentage shot that wins basketball games. But here's what happens when you put Chelsea Gray in the same starting backcourt. The systemic hierarchy of veteran deference, the unwritten law that the coaching staff created and enforces through their rotation decisions and their player management choices, demands that Clark does not just take over and push the tempo at will. She has to operate within the structure, and the structure, when Gray is on the floor at the same time, defaults to Gray's pace. Because Gray is the veteran, because Gray is the one the coaching staff has implicitly endorsed as the hierarchy's preferred floor general. So Clark hesitates. She catches the ball in transition, she sees the opportunity, and for just a beat that costs everything, she holds it. She waits to see what the system wants her to do.
And in that beat, the New Zealand defense, which should have been absolutely sprinting back in a state of complete panic, gets to set up, gets to organize, gets to put their bodies in front of the driving lanes and push the United States into exactly the kind of half-court possession that Gray is optimized for, and Clark is being artificially constrained to operate within. The offense becomes hesitant, the spacing compresses, the pace drops to a tempo where New Zealand, a team that by any objective basketball measure should not be able to stay on the floor with the United States, is allowed to play competitive defense. And then Tibbetts stands at the podium and expresses mild surprise that the first quarter didn't look great. The confusion is breathtaking. But what makes it worse, substantially, embarrassingly worse, is what happened the moment the second unit came onto the floor and how the mainstream media chose to interpret it. Because the story of the second unit is not the story the media told. It is almost the exact opposite. The narrative that crystallized in the hours after the New Zealand game, the one that was shared, amplified, and presented as the obvious and self-evident conclusion of the evening, went something like this. Caitlin Clark and the starters were flat and ineffective in the first quarter. The second unit came in and transformed the game, and therefore the veterans and the bench players are the real engine of this team, while Clark continues to be a work in progress. It is a clean narrative. It is a satisfying narrative if you are someone who has been skeptical of Clark's national team readiness from the beginning. It is also, from a basketball analysis standpoint, almost entirely backwards. Rhyne Howard exploded off the bench. She shot 6 for 10 from three-point range. She poured in 18 points on efficiency numbers that would be extraordinary in any context. Angel Reese came in and immediately dominated the glass, doing the things that Angel Reese does at an elite level. The second unit looked, to borrow the word Tibbetts himself used, spectacular. They set the tone, they blew the game open, they turned what might have been a competitive game into the kind of historic blowout that generates momentum and confidence heading into tougher matchups. No one is disputing any of that. What we are disputing, what the data and the basketball unambiguously demand that we question, is the explanation for why it happened. Did Rhyne Howard suddenly become a different player when she stepped on the floor? Did Angel Reese discover abilities in the locker room that she hadn't previously possessed? Did the second unit unlock some tactical secret that the starting unit had failed to find? Absolutely not. What the second unit found when they stepped on the floor was a New Zealand defense that was already exhausted, already disorganized, already operating on fumes from the cognitive and physical demands of the previous 7 minutes. And who put them in that state? The starting unit. Specifically, a starting unit that included, even in its constrained, tempo-suppressed, incompatibly constructed form,
Caitlin Clark. Here is something that even the most sophisticated casual basketball observer tends to underestimate about Clark's impact on a defense. It doesn't require her to be statistically dominant in a given quarter to be devastating. Her mere presence on the floor is a form of offensive terrorism. She forces defenders to make decisions they are not comfortable making, at distances they are not used to defending, on a timeline that does not allow for the kind of consultation and adjustment that good defense requires. Every screen she navigates around costs a defender physical energy and mental focus. Every time she receives the ball at or beyond the logo, two defenders have to decide in real time whether to close out or concede the shot. That decision process, multiplied across dozens of possessions, is exhausting. It is the kind of exhaustion you cannot measure in a box score, but you can absolutely see in the body language and defensive execution of the team trying to guard her. So when the second unit came onto the floor, they were not walking into a neutral situation. They were walking into a defense that the starting unit had spent 7 minutes progressively demoralizing. The lanes that Ryan Howard was draining threes through, Caitlin Clark opened those. The boards that Angel Reese was attacking with such ferocity, they existed because New Zealand's bigs were half a step slow after chasing Clark around screens and recovering from her gravity on the perimeter. The second unit capitalized beautifully on groundwork that was laid by the starters. This is not a controversial basketball concept. It is a fundamental law of how the game operates at the highest level. Starters create the conditions that allow the bench to thrive. The coaching staff knows this. Every analyst who has spent more than a week studying the game knows this, which is why the post-game narrative about the second unit saving the game is not just inaccurate, it is an active misrepresentation that serves a very specific institutional agenda. And the most damning evidence that the coaching staff itself is confused about what they are building came not from the box score, but from a single exchange in the press conference that should have been the lead story on every major basketball platform the next morning. There are moments in a press conference that change everything, not because the speaker intended them to, not because they are dramatic or emotional or delivered with the kind of weight that signals something important has been said. Sometimes the most devastating admissions are the ones delivered in the flattest, most matter-of-fact tone, because the speaker has become so accustomed to the reality they are describing that they have forgotten it is an indictment. This is one of those moments. A reporter asks Tibbetts a direct question about the disjointed offensive execution the team has shown throughout this tournament, not just in one game, throughout the tournament. And Tibbetts responds, again, almost verbatim, that it's not always easy for players to get into a rhythm when the coaches are messing with the lineups. Part of that is just seeing who works well together and who doesn't. Read that again. Let it sit for a second.
It's not always easy for players to get into a rhythm when the coaches are messing with the lineups. This is the interim head coach of the United States national women's basketball team, preparing for major international competition, openly and apparently comfortably admitting in a public press conference that he and his staff are, by his own description, messing with the lineups. Not executing a carefully designed rotation philosophy built on weeks of practice data and film study. Not deploying a deliberately flexible system that adapts to opponent scouting reports. Messing with the lineups. The phrasing itself is extraordinary. It is the vocabulary of improvisation, of trial and error, of a staff that is making it up as they go and hoping the talent on the roster is sufficient to overcome the resulting organizational chaos. And here is why this admission is so much larger than it might initially appear. This is not the preseason. This is not an exhibition game against a low-level opponent where a coaching staff has the luxury of experimenting with personnel combinations to gather data for future use. This is meaningful international competition with a team that is supposed to be preparing for the highest-stakes basketball tournaments in the world. The players on this roster have been competing at the elite level for years. Several of them have been international basketball royalty for nearly a decade. And the coaching staff's stated approach to building lineup chemistry is to observe who works well together and who doesn't by watching the results of live game action and adjusting accordingly.
That is not a coaching philosophy. That is a chaos experiment conducted with generational talent as the test subjects. Now layer in the specific context of what it means to be messing with the lineups when Caitlin Clark is on your roster. When you have a player whose entire offensive value system is built on tempo, on predictability of movement, on her teammates knowing exactly where she is going to be and when she is going to demand the ball, inconsistency of lineup construction is not a neutral irritant, it is actively destructive. Clark's offensive game does not operate in isolation. It operates as a system, as a set of understood relationships between her movement patterns and the positioning of the players around her. When those players change from game to game, from quarter to quarter, when the floor around her is populated by different combinations of personnel who have different levels of familiarity with how she reads the defense and where she wants the ball, the whole system degrades. The hesitations that everyone noticed in the first quarter against New Zealand are not Clark being out of rhythm. They are Clark trying to execute a highly sophisticated offensive system with a group of people who have been assembled in real time and told to figure out who works with whom on the fly. And all of this, the tactical contradiction, the lineup chaos, the first quarter struggles, all of it points toward the same conclusion. The coaching staff is not afraid of Caitlin Clark. They are afraid of choosing Caitlin Clark. Because choosing her, truly and completely and without hedging, means displacing veterans. It means acknowledging, in the most official and undeniable way possible, that the hierarchy has changed, that the player who arrived most recently is the player around whom the entire national team program now has to be built. And that is a political and institutional decision, not just a basketball decision. And the political and institutional dimensions of it are clearly weighing on a staff that would rather run experiments than make choices. But here is the thing about running experiments with Caitlin Clark in your lineup. The data already exists. The experiment has already been run, and the results, written in the cold language of the box score, are not ambiguous. Numbers do not have agendas. They do not care about veteran hierarchies or locker room politics or the delicate feelings of players who have been the face of a program for a decade and are watching a 22-year-old rewrite the entire operating manual. Numbers simply report what happened. And what happened against New Zealand, in a game where the coaching staff openly admitted the starting unit struggled to find a rhythm, in a game where the lineup construction was, by the interim head coach's own account, an ongoing experiment, in a game where the political and tactical tensions of this entire tournament were playing out in real time on a basketball floor, is genuinely extraordinary. Caitlin Clark played 23 minutes. In those 23 minutes, she scored 14 points, she distributed 6 assists. And the efficiency numbers embedded within those totals are the part of the story that the mainstream narrative completely ignored, because they dismantle the Clark struggled framing so thoroughly that acknowledging them becomes uncomfortable. She shot 4 for 4 on 2-point field goal attempts, a perfect 100% from inside the arc. In a game where the coaching staff constructed a first-quarter unit specifically not optimized around her strengths, in a system that was asking her to operate at a pace and in a structure that suppressed her most lethal offensive capabilities, she still found a way to score with perfect efficiency on 2-point attempts. And the how of that efficiency is just as important as the what. When the New Zealand defense made the adjustment that most defenses eventually attempt against Clark, running her aggressively off the three-point line, taking away the logo shots, daring her to operate in the mid-range, she adapted. She snaked into the paint. She used footwork that frankly nobody expected a player with her reputation as an outside shooter to possess at this level, and knocked down automatic mid-range jumpers and floaters with the composure of a 12-year veteran. She is becoming something rarer and more dangerous than a great shooter. She is becoming a complete offensive player who can hurt you at every level of the floor, and every defensive adjustment that gets made against her is revealing a new layer of capability that nobody knew was there.
But the statistic that obliterates the starting unit failed narrative more completely than any other is the plus-minus. In the 23 minutes Caitlin Clark was on the floor against New Zealand, the United States outscored them by 24 points, a plus 24 rating. In a game where she was paired with lineup combinations the coaching staff openly described as experimental. in a game where the system around her was actively working against her optimal pace, in a game where she had to adapt in real time to an incompatible backcourt partner while simultaneously reading an international defense and making split-second decisions about when to push and when to defer to the established veteran hierarchy. Plus 24 in 23 minutes. If you are trying to understand how dominant that number is in context, consider what it means mathematically. It means that when Caitlin Clark is on the floor, the United States is operating at a level of offensive efficiency that makes the game essentially unwinnable for the opponent. It means that the struggling first quarter that became the headline was not the Caitlin Clark story. It was the story of an incompatible lineup construction that even her plus 24 presence was partially overcoming just by existing on the court. It means that the narrative of the second unit saving the game is not just incomplete, it is a fundamental misreading of the basketball evidence. The tape does not lie. The math does not have a political agenda, and the math is saying, as clearly and loudly as math is capable of saying anything, that when Caitlin Clark is on the floor, this team is a different and dramatically better version of itself, even under the conditions the coaching staff is currently creating around her. Which makes what happened in the press room after the game not just frustrating, it makes it genuinely indefensible. There is a moment in the video coverage following the New Zealand game that stopped people cold. A commentator, watching the post-game media proceedings play out, asks a question that should have been answered before the game even ended. He says, and the disbelief is audible in every syllable, "How come Caitlin Clark is not at the podium yet? Like she should have gotten player of the game or something." And he is absolutely right. And the fact that the question needed to be asked at all tells you everything you need to know about the culture that the coaching staff and the media relations department have constructed around this team. This is not the first time this has happened. The commentator makes that explicit. Even in the first game where she went off, she didn't get invited to the podium. This is a pattern, a deliberate, consistent, unmistakable pattern of keeping the player with the most explosive performance, the most undeniable impact, and the largest gravitational pull on fan engagement and media attention away from the microphones, while other players and coaches occupy that space. Let's be precise about what this pattern represents, because calling it an oversight or an administrative oversight or a scheduling conflict would require a level of naivete that nobody in this space actually possesses. When an organization's media relations department makes decisions about which players appear at the podium after a game, those decisions are not made randomly. They are made with intention. They reflect a deliberate choice about which narrative the organization wants to control, which players it wants to center, and which story it wants the post-game coverage to tell. The decision to keep Caitlin Clark away from the podium after a performance that objectively merited player of the game consideration is not about logistics, it is about narrative control. The coaching staff and the media relations apparatus around this team have identified, correctly, that the moment Caitlin Clark becomes the unambiguous center of the story, the moment the cameras are literally pointed at her after a dominant performance and she is allowed to speak freely about the game, the conversation becomes entirely and irrevocably about her, about what she is doing, about what she is capable of, about what this team looks like and what it could look like if she were built around rather than managed around. And they do not want that conversation. Not yet. Maybe not ever if they can avoid it. Because that conversation leads directly to questions that the coaching staff cannot answer cleanly. Why was she coming off the bench for the first several games? Who made that decision and on what analytical basis? Why was she paired with a player who operates at a fundamentally incompatible pace? Why are the lineups being described by the head coach himself as an experiment? Why is the player with a plus 24 rating not automatically the first name on the starting five every single night? The podium is not just a media obligation. It is a stage on which accountability becomes visible.
And keeping Clark off that stage is a way of keeping those questions in the abstract, rather than having them asked directly to the person who could answer them most compellingly.
But here is the brutal irony at the core of this entire strategy. It cannot work. It has already failed. You cannot suppress a player whose impact is this total and this visible by controlling who sits at a folding table with microphones in front of them. Caitlin Clark does not need a podium appearance to validate her greatness or to make the story about her. The story becomes about her the second she crosses half court and the opposing defense reorganizes in a state of collective panic. The sold-out arenas tell the story. The television ratings that shatter records every time she plays tell the story. The highlight packages that rack up tens of millions of views within hours of each game tell the story. The coaching staff can keep her away from press conferences for the rest of this tournament. They can make sure the microphones are pointed at veterans and assistant coaches and anyone other than the player who is generating the most impact per minute on the floor. And it will not matter, because the basketball is happening in public. The plus 24 is in the public box score. The 100% shooting efficiency is in the public box score. The 6 assists that created basket after basket for teammates who were themselves celebrated at the very podium she was excluded from. All of it is in the public record, and no amount of narrative management changes what that record says. The truth doesn't need a podium. It already has the box score. And the box score is pointing toward a reckoning that the coaching staff has been desperately trying to delay, but which is now, after the New Zealand game and the press conference that followed it, completely unavoidable. Spain is not New Zealand. That sentence needs to be understood in its full weight, because the margin of the New Zealand result, 101-46, a 55-point blowout, created a statistical comfort that this coaching staff absolutely cannot afford to take into their preparation for what comes next. New Zealand allowed the United States to survive a clunky first quarter. New Zealand allowed an experimentally constructed starting unit to work through its incompatibilities without inflicting fatal early damage. New Zealand is not a team equipped to punish every miscommunication in a lineup, exploit every fractional hesitation in offensive execution, or capitalize on every moment in which a player is deferring to a veteran hierarchy rather than operating at the pace her game demands. Spain is exactly that kind of team. Spain brings to the floor the kind of defensive discipline, the kind of tactical intelligence, and the kind of collective defensive coordination that turns first-quarter sloppiness into double-digit deficits before the coaching staff has a chance to make an adjustment. They are a team that has been playing international basketball with the same core of players for years. They know each other's tendencies. They know how to read transitional triggers in an opposing offense. They know how to identify the player who wants to push pace and how to systematically deny her the conditions she needs to operate. If Caitlin Clark walks onto the floor against Spain constrained by the same incompatible lineup construction, the same systemic deference to a veteran hierarchy that operates at a slower pace, the same experimental approach to personnel combinations that the interim head coach described so casually in his post-New Zealand press conference, Spain will not allow the time for things to sort themselves out. They will not give the second unit the kind of demoralized, energy-depleted defense to exploit that New Zealand presented. Every flaw in the system will be punished. Every hesitation will be converted into points on the other end. Every moment where Clark is holding back rather than operating at the tempo she was built for will be a moment Spain uses to build a lead that becomes exponentially harder to erase as the game progresses. This is not speculation. This is basketball reality, and it is the reality that the coaching staff needs to reckon with before the Spain game, not during it. The time for experimentation is over. The data is in. The plus-minus is in. The shooting efficiency is in. The visual evidence of what this team looks like when Clark is operating at full speed versus what it looks like when she is operating within the constraints of an incompatible system.
All of it has been collected, analyzed, and communicated as clearly as basketball numbers are capable of communicating anything. There is one question that this coaching staff needs to answer before the Spain game, and it is not a complicated question. It is probably the simplest strategic question in sports. Who is your best player, and are you building the system around them? If the answer is yes, if the coaching staff can acknowledge what the entire basketball world has already acknowledged and build a starting five genuinely optimized around Clark's pace, her spacing demands, her vision, and her gravity, this is one of the most terrifying offensive units the international game has ever seen. Shooters and runners, players who thrive in transition, a floor that stretches wide and stays wide and forces defenses into the exact kind of decision-making nightmare that Clark was born to exploit. A starting lineup that does not require her to throttle back her most dangerous tendencies out of deference to a veteran hierarchy. If the answer is no, if the coaching staff continues to shuffle the deck, continues to prioritize locker room diplomacy over lineup optimization, continues to treat the player with the highest plus-minus on the roster as one variable among many, rather than the fixed point around which everything else needs to be organized, then the Spain game is going to be a very different kind of reckoning. Because here is what Nate Tibbetts accidentally confirmed in that press conference, whether he intended to or not. The experiments are failing. The traditional hierarchy is producing traditional results that are no longer good enough for the challenges ahead. The clunky first quarters and the disjointed offensive flow and the lineup inconsistency are not teething pains that resolve naturally over time. They are the predictable, measurable, documented consequences of a coaching staff that is afraid to make the one choice that the basketball is demanding they make.
The world knows who the best player on the floor is, not because of hype, not because of marketing, not because of the social media ecosystem that has formed around her, because of a plus 24 rating, because of 100% shooting efficiency, because of 6 assists in 23 minutes of basketball played in a system that was actively working against her, because of sold-out arenas and record ratings and the sheer, visible, undeniable panic in the eyes of every international point guard who has had to line up across from her. The question was never whether Caitlin Clark was ready. That question was answered months ago by anyone willing to read the evidence with honesty. The question is whether the coaching staff is ready, whether the institutional structure of the United States national team is ready to stop pretending that this is still a political decision and start treating it as the basketball decision it has always been. Hand the keys over, build the car round the engine. Stop running experiments and start running a basketball team. The window for Spain is closing, and the only acceptable version of what comes next is a starting five built entirely, unapologetically, and without political compromise around the most electrifying basketball player this sport has seen in a generation. The dam broke in that press conference room. Tibbetts said the words. The admission is on the record. What happens next? On the court against Spain, in the locker room before tip-off, in the lineup decisions made in the hours between now and that game, will determine whether this coaching staff is remembered as the group that finally got out of the way and let something historic happen, or the group that kept insisting on managing a force of nature and was surprised every time it didn't work. We do not accept the institutional spin. We do not accept the post-game narrative engineering. We do not accept a podium that excludes the player who earned the right to stand at it more than anyone else in that building. The box score is the record. The analytics are the evidence, and both of them are saying the same thing, louder with every game that passes. It is time. If you are done letting the establishment gaslight you about what you are watching with your own eyes, smash that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Drop a comment below. Does the coaching staff make the right call for Spain, or do they run the same experiment one more time and hope for a different result? I'll see you in the next breakdown.